Hey, Kim, super excited to have you on the show. You are someone that I respect because you're an improv artist that I observe on stage who is hilarious, but also you're the co founder bringing improv to Singapore and Southeast Asia. So I'm excited to have you on the show. Could you share with the folks who you are?
Sure. Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. I am Kim. I am one of the co founders of the Improv Company. We are a theatre company based in Singapore, and we specialize in improv theatre, improvised theatre specifically, which means that when we go on stage, we create shows from scratch. We don't have a script. Instead, we create it there, sometimes with the audience. Before COVID, we would sometimes even drag audience members on stage. Can't do that now. And then we create it. So sometimes there are little guidelines, but by and large, we don't know what the content will be until it's created right there in front of the audience. We also teach improv, and we go to companies and we teach them the principles of improv in an attempt to improve their resilience and to improve their creativity. So that's quite a few things that we do. And we started, I think, about 8 years ago at this point. Yes, 8 years ago. Our birthday was on 1st October, so that's not too long ago. Hmm.
Amazing. And how did you first get improv? How did that weird love begin for you?
Okay. I started improvising approximately 10, 11 years ago. I was studying in the UK, and I was looking for something to do in my spare time. And I found a improv club, and they were selling it like, oh, let's go and do it like, whose line is it anyway? And I was like, okay, I love that show. Let me try it out. And so I went to audition. I didn't get in, but I and a bunch of the other people who didn't get in said, hey, we don't need them. Let's start our own club. And that's where I started. But that's not how I started doing it in Singapore because I was in the UK at the time. I was just a player. And when I came back, I was looking for another improv club to join because I just loved doing it so much. And I've realized that at the time, there wasn't really an active group in Singapore. There would be these groups that would do it like once a year or very intermittently, but I just wanted to do it all the time. And so instead, I started a club in NUS. And after a couple of years, I was like, well, this is great, but once I'm out of NUS, I can't keep running a club. That's not really how you make a living. Can we make a living out of this? Let's try it out. Let's make a scene here in Singapore.
And there's something similar to myself. I was recommended by my wife to do improv because she took an improv class, and I tried it, and I was like, oh, it's like whose line is it anyway? And then I got hooked on improv as well, and started taking all the classes from there. Um, what was it like? Do you remember your first improv class or exercise? Could you remember what it was like?
I don't remember the first class or two. I think the first few were just kind of like, oh, who are all these people? I'm very shy. I don't know what to do. Can I do this? Am I allowed to say these things? I'm very Singaporean. And then what I do remember was my breakthrough moment was I had a glass of wine before one of the workshops. This was probably about 2 or 3 months in. And then I start doing a scene, and then you hit that flow state, right? That flow state of like, oh, I can do these things. I know exactly what I need to say now to make this work. And my partner's responding to me, I'm responding to them. We're just going step after step after step, and there's no hesitation or concern about, am I doing it right anymore? And it was only that one scene in that first workshop, when that happened. But after a while, I started coming back again and again. And then I just realized I can actually do this. And then the second thing that broke through moment was during my first couple of shows, and that hit that state again, right? And that, I think, is that high that I've been chasing ever since, of always wanting to be in that moment when I know exactly what I need to do. And it's what keeps me going back again and again. Just because when you hit that moment, you're like, this, the world is perfect. Everything is as it should be for these few minutes on stage.
I think you just perfectly encapsulated what I also love about improv. I think the way I similarly describe uh, it is those moments where I'm in a state of flow and I feel like a child
Mm.
because,
Yes.
I put away everything about work. I put away everything about what should happen in the future or has happened in the past. I'm just
Mm.
paying attention to the other person and I'm having fun
Yep.
and I'm
Yep.
in the moment. And it is as it is, right? And
Yes.
I love that moment so much. I think it's a high for sure. Um, and what's interesting is that you have this interesting duality, right? Because you're describing the high as a performer,
Mm.
and yet you are also an organizer, which
Yeah, that is
is
right.
not a high, or is it the high of organizing? All right. So you know the you're organizing the NUS club, right?
Hmm.
And then you go off, which is makes sense, right? Because So tell us more about what's it like to organize a club first at a university
Oof.
level, and then we'll talk more about how to do it at a commercial level, right? So tell
Mm,
us more
mm.
about that university level organization first. Yeah.
Okay. This brings me back. So that was probably about 9, 10 years ago. And when we start out as an organizer, you're not really thinking like, oh, I find organizing fun. For some people, sure, they love it, right? Where it really gets them going. They love organizing. I started it because I wanted to do improv. And improv and organizing are two very different beasts. When you're improvising, you're out there in the workshop or you're on stage and you're just listening to the other person. You're responding immediately, and if it works, it works. And if it doesn't work, then you find a way to make it work. And it's very immediate, it's very visceral. Whereas organization, you have to have all these timelines. You have to organize way ahead of time. You need to know exactly what goes where, which is in some ways the antithesis of improvisation. And then getting people, you have to do marketing, you have to do organization, you have to talk to the authorities to figure out, oh, what resources can you give me? So in NUS and a club, right, I think in the CFA, the Center for Arts or something like that, they would give us like rooms, right, as part of NUS stage, is what the theater club that I joined. And they would be, well, very bureaucratic about it, which really doesn't help the improv part. And so having to deal with them and then dealing with the vagaries of people coming to improv class, and each of them has their own agenda. They want either fun or they want a social time, they want to play, and so on and so forth. And you're trying to meet all these needs as an organizer. And then when it's done, then you slowly, you quietly beat yourself up. Oh man, I could have run it this way. I could have made them happier. And then you have to pick yourself up and then do it again the next week. And this is in aid of a future goal of getting back on stage and creating improv scenes and so on and so forth. But after a while you get better at it, right? So it's not like the first time it's horrible, and then after a while you learn your lessons, you get better at it, and you start meeting people's needs, or even meeting their needs that they don't necessarily know that they want initially. And then you kind of train them to want certain things and they get better at that. And together you forge together as a team, and you're finding that they're also contributing in different ways. So by the time I was done with the NUS stage of my career, for running an improv club, I realized a few things. Like, one is that, I was brought up to be very independent, to not trust anyone, but you can't really do this alone. And so I had opened up quite a lot and trying to seek help where I could, as well as, is what you want as an improviser is not always what everyone else wants. Surprise, other people have different needs and wants, and so you try to meet that as well in a different way. Sometimes those might also contradict your own personal wants, because it's kind of like for the greater good of the community or the company. What can you do to meet that while also taking care of yourself and your own needs? And there are all kinds of lessons along the way that they don't really teach you when you are starting out as a club.
Yeah, and that must have been a huge shift as well from the university level to then say, okay,
Ooh.
I now want to found this as a commercial level, right? Because now, there's economics involved, the
Mm.
fundamental, business model of a theater, right? And
Mhm.
all these other things. So walk us through what I'd like to say, I would like to be the, co-found, the improv company.
Right. So when you graduate and you're thinking, "Hey, what career should I do?" And me and my partner Hazel, at the time, we were just fresh grads, and we were thinking, do we want to do this improv thing now, or should we do what would the sensible thing would be, like all our parents were saying at the time, go get a proper job, and do that first, and then if you want to do improv on the side, you can do that. And I think for the two of us, we were like, you know what, now's the time. Like, if we get a job, we might get distracted, we might find ourselves on a very different path. But do we want to do this? And I think for us, the answer was very immediately, yes, let's do this now. After a year, after 2 years, let's see where we are. And if it's not going well, we have time. We don't have kids to support, we don't have family to support, we can financially afford this step. So we took that step initially, and we were actually really lucky. We found kind of very low cost, low exposure ways to keep it going. And a lot of it was kind of just bootstrapping it ourselves, and even just doing the hard work ourselves, not automating anything, trying to keep everything as lean as possible. Like, the rent for our initial space was, I think, something like 500 a month, which is a little ridiculous given like real estate prices in Singapore.
Wow,
Uh,
amazing.
Yeah, and we shared it with an artist, and we also were. It was made of wood, so every time we jumped, our downstairs neighbor would get pissed. All these kind of things that I probably wouldn't accept now at this stage where we are. I would just be like, no, let's throw some money at the problem because that's not a problem I have the energy to deal with now. But at the time, we were young and we were, in many ways, quite naive. But we were like, we can do this. Let's make it happen. And then after that is marketing. How do we get people to understand what improv is and why they should do it? And there's that persuasion, that conversation took place many times in many rooms over with many different people. And just understanding how to persuade people that improv is worth their time. And after a while, we started accumulating people around us that believed what we had told them and what we had demonstrated to them in those first classes. And it was a real learning journey, right? Because as a club, your kind of accountability is very different. You don't have a bottom line. You just turn up, and if you suck at it, they don't come back. But if you suck at it when you are in the real world, you lose money. And financially, there are some real consequences for that. We had people scolding us in our first few classes, like, "What are you doing? This is really unprofessional." And we're like, "Okay, let's learn from that. Let's make it better." And we keep learning these lessons over and over, year after year. And then we're always finding new things to do. So, like when we first ran the Improv Festival, our first Singapore Improv Festival, this was 2016. We learned a lot because it was a bigger scale in terms of events than anything we had done before. We would do single shows at a time up to that point, and so suddenly we had like a whole weekend of shows, and we were like, okay, this is horrifyingly difficult. And also, we gave ourselves like a month to deal with it, and which is horrifyingly naive as well. Now that we know what it takes, actually, that was really too ambitious. So we learn and we grow. We're always constantly trying to figure out what is our next milestone. How can we grow? How can we scale into something more and reach more people? But I would not trade this for anything. I would not take a desk job and work for someone else at this point because it's just um, it's a bit of a drug, right? You learn all these things. You're affecting so many people. You're changing lives, and I think if I were to tell my younger self 8 years ago, 9 years ago, hey, you should go there, desk job, I would not tell them that. I'd be like, yeah, do this. It's going to suck for a horribly long time and suck in many different ways, but you should do this.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to talk about, I guess the highs you get is improv performer and the highs as a founder
Yeah,
and a
also quite
leader,
different. Yeah.
different. And also, you also interestingly you talk about some of the realities, right, about the world as well.
Mm,
So let's talk about both of those, right? So let's talk about the realities, right? So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the realities you said of being a founder and building without, the belief of everybody around you, right? Versus being a performer. What
mm,
was that transition like for you? Yeah. What did you have to learn, I
mm.
think, in terms of skills or attitude or mindset? Yeah.
So my when I was in college, I learned political science and theater studies, neither of which did anything to prepare me for the real world. I think in my final semester, I took a couple of business modules, which was okay, a little bit of like working and pitching to people, um, but I think college did nothing for me other than that, other than a slight kind of time to refine my technique as a coach. It did nothing for that. So when you get out there and you're talking to people, there are often so many competing things and trying like our competition isn't actually like other improv theaters. Our competition is anything that would take someone's time or energy. So like cinemas, for example, or a walk in the park. Why should someone do improv as opposed to going for a nice walk in the park? And trying to persuade them to do that is also just that constant conversation and trying to read your audience and understanding what do they want, what do they need, can I appeal to that want and that need, which wasn't in theater studies at all. Theater studies was really about the history of theater, which was I guess interesting but not the main thing. And then we're having to learn organization, for example, like compliance, basic compliance. They don't teach you that in like, theater studies. Marketing management wasn't an issue for a long time, because for most of my coaches, we were friends, and so we have very informal conversations like, oh, there are these students, how are they doing, how are you doing, okay, yeah, great. But once we started hiring people full time, that was a very different kettle of fish. And to understand, it's a fresh grad, what do they need, all these basic things you took for granted as a founder, you're running it yourself, and now you're turning to delegate and saying, hey, can you do it? And then they return and you're like, this is totally not what I was asking for. And then your team starts to grow. And trying to let go of some of that control initially can be, it was a learning process. Like initially we had 100% control, and now it's maybe about 40%, 50% control, because you need to trust people to do these things in different ways. All that journey is very different. But I think my initial argument for myself in doing that initially was, hey, this is what it takes to get out there and do improv. Okay, this is a sacrifice I'll do. At this point, it's a little bit of a different, because of a different equation where I enjoy it and I enjoy the impact that it has on people. So when I see someone taking our classes and coming out changed, or they made new connections, or they're more open, and they're getting out on stage with that kind of confidence that in class one of Improv 101, you wouldn't have seen that do. That is a real tangible change that's very satisfying. And it's not even a cost anymore. It's just a needed thing to do in order to get to that extra thing. And I also still do improv, right? I perform. And I think possibly a bit of the perks of being a founder is that I can perform when I want to, as opposed to other people when they kind of have to go through us. And so I'm like, I'll do a show. Yes, I get to do it. Awesome. I'm very happy to take that perk. I feel like sound a little arrogant, but it's kind of an earned privilege at this point. That we stuck in it for 8 years, so I get to do shows when I want to. And when
Yeah.
I don't feel like it, I'm like, okay, let's enable other people to get that on that stage.
Yeah, I mean, also there's also plenty of spots, and improv is a group collaborative sport, right?
Yes.
And I totally get it, because I think for myself, in my first, I started because I wanted to volunteer at an organization in social impact consulting, because I had been a volunteer in that before, and so I wanted to set it up in Singapore, and it did not exist. So I went about setting it up, and then I ended up somehow
Yeah.
founding it and then leading it, and then, unlike you, I never got a chance to volunteer again at it, because I was too busy organizing and building it, which was a shame in some ways,
Mm,
because I never got to reconnect at that fundamental level, which was interesting, right? At the energy level. So I
mm,
think it's totally not just in your right, but I think it's better for the organization that you reconnect at the base level, right? Which is the
mm.
fundamental joy, right? Which is,
Yes.
if you as the leader don't get to re-experience the high that you first got when you first tasted improv, you know, when you were a youngling,
Mm.
right?
That's
How do
quite
you stay connected
interesting.
to the ground, right?
Because I've thought about this in a while, once in a while, because burnout is a real thing. Once in a while, I think, should I step back from, say, coaching, or should I step back from performing? And that has been the idea of doing that has been very feasible, or rather quite plausible, right, at various points. And every time I do that, I find this increasing disconnect. And I think if I was just running an improv theater for as a business, it would be quite different. Whereas we are doing it as a way not just of earning a living, but also of increasing the numbers and increasing the engagement that our current improvisers have with the art form and with each other. And so there are trade-offs to be made for that. But the way we are doing it, in some ways, we share some DNA with, say, a social enterprise where profit isn't the main driver. It is a driver, but partly is survival, partly is just to get people to continue to do the art form.
Yeah. And that's the tricky part that you mentioned, right? Because, I think creative and performer burnout is a real thing, right? Often because of that mixed motivation, right? Because it's
Yes.
not just economics, and also the economics are not great, to be honest, as well, right?
No.
Uh, and then you add on all of this personal identity, as well as the labor of love and all these other dynamics, and it's very interpersonal.
Mm.
So I'm just curious, like, how do you think about how yourself or other performers are thinking about how to process that, because it's also kind of funny, right? Is it like, improv is all ha ha comedy,
Mm.
we should be happy all the time and optimistic, and then here we are, working, to make all of this smooth, on time, seamless,
Mhm.
a great experience for those learning, a great experience for those observing in part of the audience, a great experience for those who are performing. So how does all of that process for you?
Um, So it goes back to what I mentioned as a founder, as a leader, you're looking at what your people need. And in terms of financial compensation, that's not really going to work out well for most improvisers. Um, if you're coaching, okay, that can be a plausible thing to do. And we do pay our coaches and we try to pay them fairly, and we pay our full time staff. But for the performers, they tend not to get financially compensated. So we need to take care of them in other ways, whether it's making sure their needs are met, giving them the space to perform, whether it's giving them say feedback, or saying encouragement when the shows don't go well, and say, hey, can we take care of each other? And taking care of each other can come in so many ways, whether it's just checking on them or giving them the opportunity to express themselves, or looking at, oh, let's say the scene as a whole. What do we need? If are we doing a lot of short form and people are finding that they're plateauing, then what is the next step for them? Or if they're doing a certain kind of show, can we broaden it? Can we open their eyes, open their horizons to other ways that they can expand themselves and to increase that kind of engagement so that they holistically grow not just as improvisers but also as performers and as people. And if they are looking, or say COVID happens and people are feeling the uncertainty, can we then show that the face of like stability and say and optimism so that people don't feel that constant like crashing of oh, everything's changing all the time, or do we have no anchor? We want to be that anchor for people. And so there's different ways of just reading each other, taking care of each other, and making sure that if someone's feeling down or they're feeling burnt out, how can we help them? Or if they're feeling that plateau, how can we let them grow, and so on and so forth.
When you think about that growth, how do you personally grow? I mean, is it, I mean, beyond, of course, Dell clothes and I guess reading improv textbooks or
Hmm. Hmm.
materials and all there. But I'm just kind of curious, like today, where you are, as an improv performer, as a founder of the improv company, as a,
Hmm.
effectively an owner of the theater, and pushing on in the middle of, midst of a global pandemic. There's also many pandemic restrictions.
Mm.
How are you seeing this next stage of personal growth? Like, what are you looking to learn? What are you reading? What are you
Right.
consuming to
Hmm.
for this stage of personal growth, for better or for
Okay.
worse? Yeah.
I think as a performer, one thing the pandemic has done, which was unexpected, and was that we are now connecting with improvisers from all over the world, online through either Zoom or other mediums, where they're running classes or their jams or meetings. So I think I've done workshops where we get improvisers to Zoom in, and then they watch a performance or a lesson that we are doing, and then they give feedback. And these people can be anywhere, like in the US, Europe, anywhere they are based, and they can do it because of the magic of communication, the internet. And then we can connect with that, which wasn't true prior to the pandemic. I think people were doing it, but on a much smaller scale. But necessity drove everyone online, and when everyone's online, they're like, "Oh, can we connect? Can we do these things?" Um, and so our initial experiments with it were sometimes a bit abortive, like they just wouldn't work or whatnot. But I think at 1 year in, it's a lot more polished now, and people are it's very scheduled, and a lot of it, unfortunately, is US or Europe time zones. But a few of them are actually Asian focused, so we can still connect in that sense. Other than that, I'm finding that the Singapore scene is at a stage where we can talk to each other and we can garner things from each other, where it wasn't really true, say 6 years ago, where I was one of the very few experienced improvisers and there wasn't anyone to give me feedback. Now that's not true. A lot of the improvisers now are more experienced than I was when I started out, and they are developing their own voice, they're developing their specialties. And so if I want to venture into that and say, oh, I want to do, say, puppet improv, I want to do game-based improv, I now have people that I can consult with and talk to and learn from. And it's a matter, I think at the start, you got this sense of yourself as, oh, I'm the most experienced in the room, I need to show that high status. uh, I think I've learned that that's no longer true. I'm no longer necessarily the best at all of it. And so that's great, because now I can learn from other people. I don't have to be the first out the door to pave the way. And the effort to get better at that is no longer as much as it used to be. So it's a great opportunity to do that. But there are also other ways of growing, right? So I can learn in terms of, say, as a business, how can I learn? How can I scale up? What can I do? And I think we've learned a number of things over the years. So like this year, for example, we are now doing kids camps. We are expanding into that. Where prior to that, I hated teaching kids. It just doesn't work for me. It drained so much from out of me. But I had a couple of improvisers who offered essentially to help us get it off the ground, and they've been helping us, they're consulting with us and driving that change. So now we are using our space in the middle of the day where kids can go and learn improv, and they're running it. And for us, we're just like providing the space and enabling that to happen, while also, it gives the company a bit more of a stable financial base. And then also is that myself also opening up to the fact that kids can have a space in improv. It's true, and letting them experience that. So I'm hoping that in 10 to 15 years time, when these kids have reached like adulthood, they'll have been doing it for so long, and we'll be seeing new things coming out where they are learning, they're showing new areas that maybe we can't even imagine today. But that's kind of the long game for the improv scene in Singapore.
Wow, I love that long game, to be honest, because, I think one thing that, I got to experience while I was learning improv in Boston, New York was in New York, really getting to see people who saw comedy and improv as a career, right? you
Yes.
know, I mean, they really saw it as a career. They had been preparing it for it from
Hmm.
not necessarily as a kid, but at least from a teenager,
Hmm.
and working hard at it
Yep.
as a hobby, as a practice, as an art form, and then going to it as an adult, right?
Mm.
And the economics and industries that are supported. So I think it's interesting to see that you building this out would definitely be a great way for kids to ignite and discover if they have a love for stand up slash comedy slash improv slash whatever it is, right, that
Mm.
turns out for them.
Yeah.
um, so uh, so what's interesting here, of course, is that you're just kind of like building out this larger tent as well, right, of new folks coming in to spearhead different programs, different initiatives, different verticals
Yeah.
of this. And so I almost see you like these like three hats, right, that you have, right? So you have a performer,
Hmm.
Kim.
Mm.
Then you have the founder, Kim, who was the guy who built it out from 0 to 1. That's there. And then now you have this community organizer slash node,
Yeah.
traffic
Yes.
control, Kim. All right, where everything kind of like kind of like it's kind of like you're not the center of it, right? But
Mm.
you're a key node of that overall network that's starting to emerge in Singapore about that. Uh, how do you feel about that evolution over time?
Broadly good. I think I'm used to wearing multiple hats, right? So as a founder, as a performer, those are two quite different things, like we mentioned earlier. As a community thing, as a kind of enabler in some ways, it's. I think the first time I realized this was probably about 4 years ago. I think that was just this weekend, and I realized there were 4 or 5 improv shows happening in Singapore, none of which were organized by me. And I realized I was like, oh, this is great. This is exactly what we set out to do, because when you're talking about the improv scene and we wanted to do an improv scene, it's not the improv company. The improv company is its own thing, and we obviously want to be successful. We want to have that sustainability. We want to stick around and influence the scene in positive ways. But the scene is its own thing, and if I think that was the first milestone, we were like, we have kind of made it, and we want to sustain that. We want that to keep happening weekend after weekend, where we are organizing shows, but other people are also organizing shows. This has unfortunately taken a bit of a back seat, I think, or a bit of a step backwards rather, in COVID times, because now venues are significantly numbers restricted, so people can't. It's very difficult for an independent organizer to set up their own show at the moment. But prior to that, we were actually seeing quite a big number of people running their own shows. And in fact, we are now seeing uh, new students who have come through our doors in the last 2 years or so, starting to form their own teams. So I believe, we are doing a show in early November, where I think 7 of 9 teams are new, and not some of them are veterans, but they are new teams. But a lot of them are students who've just finished their classes and they've done their showcases with us, their recitals essentially, and they're like, I want to keep doing this thing. I want to create more shows. all of which have had nothing to do with us. Our role is basically saying, hey, students, you should go form new teams. Go do new teams now. And they're like, okay. And they did it. And I'm like, okay, they're all new teams. Going to be a complete new weekend of complete teams. So as an enabler, I'm a little concerned because I don't know how good these shows are going to be. But as organizer, this is amazing. This is a great milestone. All these new students are going to be there. If we can keep them encouraged and basically like keep them going, in a couple of years, they'll be doing new shows, creating new work, creating content, reaching new people, finding new audiences in new venues. Hopefully, when COVID clears up, they'll be going out there and creating as much improv as possible. And volume has its own quality, right? They'll start reaching so many people that people wonder, oh, what's improv? And then the scene becomes, it reaches that critical mass and it keeps going on its own kind of steam. And we want to be there to help enable that and to catalyze that. But we don't want to be the only player in town.
Yeah, it's amazing to see that you being that individual performer, being you being the first one to be one of the first few performing, and
Oh,
then
yeah. I guess I
you
also want to be there doing shows. That's definitely a thing. That's not going to stop. Yeah.
never gonna stop, right? Does it feel weird because you always like as a performer you're one of the people on the stage, right?
Mm.
And then as a founder you're one of the few people bringing the stage to light, right? And then now finally the show is moving down the road without you, right? In that sense,
Mm.
right? Which is good, like you said, right? Because you finally the dream is coming true, right? the
Yeah.
the movement has momentum, right?
Yes.
But do you feel like nostalgia? I don't know, like, or like, I don't know, or do you foresee yourself getting nostalgia one day? I'm just so curious.
In a very limited fashion. I think
Yeah.
in some ways it felt like fewer responsibilities and fewer things could go wrong. And you're like, sometimes, uh, that moment of, oh, I'm going to do a show in 3 weeks. That's literally the only thing I have to prepare for. Great. I can devote all my energy to that. Now that's not going to happen. That has not happened for a long time. There's always something to deal with. But I vastly prefer now because now we have the resources, now we have the connections, now we have the community base to go and make so much more happen. Just as a benchmark, right? So we had, I think, 7 shows the last weekend, the first weekend of October, and that's as many as we had in our first improv festival. And that's insane. Just we do this on the regular basis now. We do this multiple times a year, and it's not even a festival, it's just a weekend of improv shows, and we've moved to that level already. So clearly our festival needs to be like, I don't know, 20 shows, 30 shows. We need to reach like thousands of people at this point to say we've moved up, we've leveled up. um, and that's great. That's progress. I want that progress to keep going. I want us to become a mainstay in the Singapore theatre scene, in the Asian theatre scene, and say, hey, improv is not some side gig. Improv is not just a thing that some actors learn in their first year at LaSalle or something. Improv is this art form, is alongside anything that is happening in the theatre scene, the art scene. And so that, if someone if they're thinking, what should I do this weekend? Improv is on that short list, whether it's performing or going to see it, or even just just checking it out, just going by. Oh, I would like to see something on Friday night. Oh, improv. Let's do that. Yeah, that's where we want to go. It doesn't. We don't want it to be a thing where people go, "Oh, what's improv?" The day that no one asks me what's improv when I say I'm an improv teacher, is kind of the day I'll say that's the next time I'll say I've made it.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that so much. I love that so much. Um, I'd just like to kind of like turn the page a little bit here, which is, could you share with us a time that you have been brave, or times you
Ooh,
have been?
okay. I think the first time will probably be when I started this. Probably started the improv company because when we started, we had no idea what we were doing. So as much foolhardy as brave. But more recently, I think this year, in fact, has been a really interesting year in terms of where we've been performing. So prior to this year, we would perform in like small bars or small theaters, maybe once a little show, and then it'll be done. It'll be we're finished. We were kind of forced into like larger venues because of COVID. And at the end of last year, we did a show where I think the main storyline was about a couple that was like two guys, yeah, so a gay couple, and they were thinking about adopting. And what happened was, in our licensing application, a few months later, we submitted that video because the show was a really good show, and we were like, okay, let's show this to the IMDA as part of our license application, and they got, well, concerned, shall we say, because apparently, if you have a gay couple as the main storyline, your licensing needs to be restricted so the little children cannot see the show. It cannot be the main focus, essentially. And so, as a result of that, I got invited in for a 4 hour interview with the IMDA, which, as a Singaporean born and bred, it made me terrified, essentially. Because I was like, oh, I'm being investigated. I'm in trouble with the authorities. And the 4 hours was a fascinating 4 hours. I mean, at the time, it was very stressful. And we were just like, am I in trouble? Are we going to be allowed to continue operating? And the conversation has moved on since then. And we've had a lot of help. In particular, Singji was one of my improviser friends from back in the day. He was in NUS actually. And he caught wind of this and he's been helping us pro bono, giving us advice and corresponding with the government. We are essentially at this point having this extended conversation with them on what is improv, how can we continue to do improv shows while also, with the understanding that, as the government, they have certain needs and requirements and they have their own agenda on what kind of art form they are going to essentially allow, like I say this, allow on stage in public, and they have to balance that public good with their own needs. And we want to keep doing shows. We want to keep doing improv, and we want to keep saying things that matter to people, that are important, and not also deal with the idea of censorship. And so this conversation is still ongoing. The investigations haven't been closed yet. They're keeping us a bit on tenterhooks. Um, so we are operating in this kind of semi limbo where we still have to keep doing stuff. And they are giving us licenses at this point, and they've even created a special improv show checklist for us, where everything that we've talked to them about so far is on that list. The only thing that isn't there is like it's not just the improv company doing shows, but essentially is our conversations are reflected in that checklist. And so we want to make sure we can still continue to teach improv and bring that spirit of resilience and creativity to Singaporeans and to whoever is living here, while also towing that line of saying things that we want to say. I will say it has been quite inspiring. We've done a couple of political satire shows because of this, where I think prior to this year we wouldn't have done it because of that fear of crossing that line. But the line's been crossed, so we are like, let's go ahead and say these things. Let's say things that matter.
What's interesting, is a lot of different topics that are here, right?
Mm,
Which is really about arts. It's about saying things that do matter, and obviously what's the public good. And these are
mm,
all very big concepts, but also mean a lot to individual people. Personally, I do have loved ones who are and friends who are LGBTQ,
mhm.
and so for that, uh, you know, and actually, I do believe I was at that show,
Ah,
and I was very touched by that show actually. So I personally enjoyed that show from a um, artistic,
mm,
and I think it mattered, right, from a comedic perspective.
mm,
But it's also funny because it touches on a real aspect of human life, right?
yeah,
I think as my old instructor used to say, right, it can only be funny if it's real, right?
yeah. Truth in
Because
comedy is a
yeah,
common improv thing, right?
exactly, right? If there's no basis in reality and the real human experience, it's not funny, right? True comedy can only come in the most true of human moments, right?
Yep.
So I think there's an interesting dynamic where, as a result, comedy helps us alleviate us from uh, the elephants in the room, right? And
Yes.
so there's that interesting intrinsic tension, I think,
Yeah.
between all these different aspects.
Yeah.
Um, so I think there's this awkward realities, of course, in doing that. And I remember actually learning that for myself as a performer in the US, where
Mm,
also a different aspect of that
mm,
would be that what is considered cultural norms in Singapore would not be considered cultural norm in the US, right? Uh, you know, um, so having to learn, like simple things like gender expressions
Yeah.
or like
Mm.
stereotypes versus archetypes
Mm.
are quite thin line actually, especially when you're improvising on the spot.
Yes.
And
I've
you
been
know,
there.
yeah, I think every improviser has been there. It's hard to do, and it's also a function of the audience as well, right?
Yep.
At the moment
Yeah.
as well.
And so in Singapore, I think we are towing that every context is different. So I think if you're performing in the US, you're performing in the Europe, for example, or Australia, you are doing it slightly differently. And Singapore's context is its own brand of unique, where we have a government that does want to open up that space, but it also wants that space to open up in a circumscribed way. And we are kind of feeling in the dark and saying, "Oh, where is the edge? Can we cross this line? If we cross this line, can I poke my toe over that line and see what happens? What if I take a step over? What are the consequences going to be like? Can we deal with those consequences?" And then, from a community standpoint, our performers are going to be concerned about that. And when they're new and kind of less experienced, there's additional fear because they are like, "Oh, where is that line? Am I allowed to do that?" We have a lot of performers who are EP holders, and their concerns are very real. There are very real consequences if they do it too much. And so for us, we do want to find, where is that line? Can we cross that line? Are there different zones where we can be in terms of artistic expression? And can we take care of our people while also maintaining the artistic integrity? And I think this conversation in Singapore is going to continue for as long as we want to do art.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because it's how do you create space where there hasn't been space,
Yes.
and yet comedy is about lines and creating
Yes. Yeah.
space, right?
Yep.
Um,
So if you kind of stay within the safe zone, that also takes away a lot of your power. And so we kind of have to venture out. But then if we venture out too far, there's consequences. So where is a bit like, it's a bit of a minefield where the borders aren't super clearly defined. And that's the thing about Singapore. We do have some laws that are deliberately vaguely defined so that gives the government, the authorities, more power in a way that kind of has plausible deniability. And that's just the life of a citizen living in Singapore as an artist as well.
Yeah. And I think that it's in the public good, right? Which is, I think, fair. I think there are key reasons why, right? In terms of like multiculturalism, racial and
Mhm.
religious harmony.
Yeah,
So I think there's, good reasons, I think,
yeah,
for all of that. I don't think there's a clear requirement, and I think everybody's figuring it out as we go along. Like you said, improv is a new art form.
hmm,
So I think nobody builds a law with the awareness that improv is going to come along and
yeah, yeah. That's fair.
be there. So I definitely agree with you about that.
Mm.
Yet, like you said, the interesting part is that the court jester has been a problematic person for generations and centuries, right?
Yeah.
Hit that role of the jester, the Joker, has been a valuable one
Mm.
for generations and generations and various kings and queens
Mm.
in the court, uh, but also has been a problematic and torturous role for them
Yeah. I
for the
think
same reason.
I do feel like part of this is also we don't know what will be said or what can be said. I might not be the one to say something that will change the world, improv wise in Singapore, but someone else, maybe some kid who does 2 hour camp, 10 years down the road, he does a show that blows people's minds, and we want to pave the way for that. And so it's kind of like trying to figure out those boundaries so that people following our community today, as well as someone next year in 10 years time, they have something they want to say something, that space is there for them to say that.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's also a good point, right? Because all of us have individual responsibilities as performers, yet we also have stewardship, like you said, for this to continue
Yeah.
as an art form for other people to appreciate the art form. Um, and I think one interesting that you think that you also talked about earlier was also like one big brave moment was you deciding to build it out and without really knowing what you were building. So can you tell me what you mean by being brave in that context?
Bravery is such an interesting concept, right? So like if someone sees there's clear physical danger, let's say a fire, and they rush into the fire, they make that choice to do that, knowing they could die or be severely injured to rescue someone. That's bravery. For us, when we started out, I don't know if we knew there was a fire. We were like this. We were like, oh, is that area is kind of like there's a bit of a fog of war going on. We're not sure what's behind that shadow or behind that door. Let's step through it and see what happens. And then we did it. Knowing that other people our age would be getting, I don't know, say starting salaries of like 3 to 4K a year. For us, we started out at one, and we were constantly draining our finances for a few years, thinking, okay, let's see where this goes. We know there's going to be a significant cost to this, but we think that is a plunge worth taking, so let's take that plunge. And every year, I think for a few years, we were like, oh man, this hurts a lot. This is really bad. Should we keep going? Can we sustain this for another year? And it was eventually a choice that we kept making over and over again, year after year. Say, you know what, let's give this another year. Let's give this another year. At this point, I haven't had that conversation with myself, right, for a couple of years now, where we've had to ask ourselves, should we give this a year? The answer was immediately, yep, let's keep going. It's going well. Let's keep this going. And so we've crossed that. We've left that behind. I think in that sense, bravery for us was taking the plunge and thinking we are going to hurt from this. How much hurt we are not sure, but we are willing to take that, even though it's an open-ended question of the how much hurt, and make it happen because the potential outcome is worth the potential hurt.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. And, I think it's true that based on your original definition of it, which is that if you're fully aware of all the dangers and risks and the blood, sweat, and tears and all the troubles you're going to put yourself through, uh, which is also pretty inhuman because most humans have zero ability to foretell the future.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, you don't hit that bar. Yet I would respectfully disagree. I think you were brave in the context of still pushing out to choose to do so. And I think my suspicion is I don't think you were that naive anyway from day one. I do think you got smart pretty fast and savvy, and maybe you got smarter over time pretty quick about how much risk you were actually taking more and more over time. And so over time, the actual level of bravery you were by that standard actually kind of like ticked up, right? So maybe month one you weren't that brave by that standard that you put it at, but maybe by that standard you put it at, by month 3, month 6, you're probably like fully priced in at 100%
Yeah,
proof,
yeah, that's fair.
bravery, because by then you already knew how hard it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
The economics, the theater, the business model. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also changed, right? Because now it's no longer a question of fiscal viability. It is. We know that. It's also a question of like artistic kind of worth and integrity, and also knowing now that we have these resources, do we have the responsibility to make something of it, to make it bigger, to scale up, to reach more people, to try to create new things in different ways, to make a different impact. Because we know we've made an impact. Can we make more of it? Can we make a different kind of impact on a different group we haven't reached before? So like now we are trying to give out scholarships to people to try and reach, like more underprivileged people because we realized that was a blind spot for us. We didn't realize until fairly recently. But now we have the resources. Can we do that? To be honest, right now I don't know if we've made a positive impact yet. We've given out a few. Will it last? We don't know. So we'll keep doing that for a while. We'll try and study it, understand more, and then we're wondering what's next year going to be like. And things open up again. Can we reach even more people? Can we use our resources in with the best return, given where we are? And I think there is that responsibility, lah. Like if we are stable, we don't just keep where we are. We want that progress. We want to get to improve that influence, get that resilience and creativity in Singapore to new levels.
What's interesting is that you seem to be like creating new challenges for yourself, right?
Yeah,
Or at
yeah.
least reinventing the next phase for yourself, at least in this stage, right? Because you reinvented yourself as a performer, you reinvented yourself as a founder, you reinvented yourself as a self-described, enabler, um, and now you're talking about it in terms of artistic integrity and improving representation.
Mhm.
Um, so you know, if wrapping things up here, if you had a time machine, we did improv scene and you had a little time machine and you went to that cardboard box, Calvin Hobbes style, and then you travel back in time to yourself, in university, right?
Mm.
Before you went into your first improv class. Uh, what advice would you give yourself, or how would you hang out with
Mm.
yourself back then?
That's a great question. Um, I think I would want to tell myself to be less afraid. I'm a very risk averse person, is the way I was brought up. And the first few years, we were going like super cautiously, like step by step by step. I would probably want to bring on some investors, some partners with different skill sets from mine, just so that we could grow it in different ways beyond what me and Hazel were originally capable of. Because when you're talking about two people, and we're talking everything's labor intensive, we're doing everything manually by hand. Sure, sustainable, yeah. But if we had, say, another two people on our team with a different skill set, maybe a marketing person and maybe someone else who is able to reach out to corporates a little bit more to organizational development, so that we can really build that out faster and more aggressively, then that base becomes, that has a knock-on effect. It compounds over time. Um, and I think where we are now, we could have done this with different in a different way, a different approach. But we could have been here maybe 3, 4 years ago. Yeah. So honestly, I'll just give myself advice like that now. Hey, I should just get a couple of people right now who are better at that than I am, or better at who my team are at now. And so we can, in 2 years' time, we would be a level where if we grew organically, we would be in another 6 years. But we could probably do that now. So yeah, I don't really need a time machine. Just tell myself that right now.
To both time machine to yourself right now and a time machine back in time as well. So twice. Uh, awesome. Wrapping things up here, Kim, I'd love to kind of like paraphrase the three big themes that I got from this discussion.
Mm,
I think the first of all, thank you so much for sharing about the highs of improv in so many different facets. I love how you describe the high of improv when you not necessarily when you first took improv, like you said, but when it first clicked for you in terms of flow state,
yeah.
when time flew by so cleanly for you, and when everything just flew by on stage.
Mhm.
Uh, and yet you also describe the high of being in improv and seeing people learning improv and flourishing on stage and gaining self-confidence in their own voice, and also the high of seeing other people step up in their own role in the improv community as their own voice, as their own coach, as their own shows. So I love that description of the highs of improv in so many different ways in so many different years. Second, of course, is thank you also for sharing about the realities of being a performer
Mm,
versus a founder versus an enabler. I loved what you said about what drove you to be a performer in the early days,
mm,
and what was the skill gap slash things you had to learn in order to become the
mm,
founder of the improv company, working alongside Hazel to bootstrap that, what it was like, and that wooden floor where you couldn't jump, otherwise you disturb your downstairs neighbor, um, as well as I think the reality now of being an enabler where the ecosystem is larger and you're able to have resources to push on forward,
mm,
and how you now have the challenge of staying connected still to the pulse of the ground by being able to volunteer as a performer at your own shows, while also keeping to push for artistic integrity and more representation by the underprivileged in Singapore for improv. And lastly, thank you for at least giving us a little window into like what I call the society spaces and windows around artistic dynamics and movements. I think it's an interesting dynamic and trade-offs, and it's a moving fluid, currents, right? Between, I think, like you said, public good, between the government's understanding and learning, as well as improv as a new art form,
Mm.
as well as, like you said, the individual performer stewardship around our own responsibilities
Mm.
versus the future generations
Yeah,
of kids
yeah.
learning improv and what they get to experience. And there's a lot of fluidity there. And I guess our big hope is that it, that we enjoy improv right now as performers and audience members and as uh, participants. And in 10 to 20 and 30 years, we get to enjoy the next generation of improv performers and coaches, make
Mm.
us laugh our asses off. Yeah.
Actually, just to add on to that a little bit, I think looking forward to my deathbed, not looking forward in the sense that I want to die, but more like ahead rather. What if I were to die happy would to be to see that Singapore has, we've done enough to infuse that culture with the kind of resilience and the positive looking out for each other. That the idea in improv, right? You want to make your partner look good, and in Singapore to lift each other up beyond just the day-to-day existence of grinding, of the survival, the idea of survival, the narrative myth that we've had fed to us in social studies. We can lift each other up. We don't want to just coexist. We want to be brothers and sisters on this stage of life, right? Where we are like, if you're doing great, let me help you out. Let me acclaim you where that is needed or where that is deserved. And in turn, you do the same for me. And I think culture change for us would be like the holy grail, right? The ultimate, like that's us winning the game. If Singapore's culture can change to one where that is where making your partner look good can be a part of our fabric, where we don't really necessarily see that immediately right now, where there's competition and whatnot, but we compete in a way that is more than just us.
Amazing. I love that so much. Kim, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.